A homeless man stopped Keanu Reeves outside a movie set and asked, "Can you give me $1?" Keanu paused something. In the man's eyes felt eerily familiar. Within minutes, that single request would unravel a long-buried Hollywood betrayal and lead to a discovery that would change both of their lives forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun hadn't yet broken the Hollywood skyline when Daniel Rivera slipped quietly down the alley behind the Warner Crossback studio lot. The street was still damp from the night's drizzle, giving the cracked concrete a faint silver sheen. To most passers-by, he was just another shadow moving between dumpsters, forgotten and unremarkable. But Daniel walked with a quiet intention, the kind of stillness only a man used to being invisible could perfect. At 54, Daniel had the lean, hardened frame of someone who hadn't slept indoors in a very long time. His hair, once black and meticulously groomed, now hung in graying strands beneath the hood of his fraying jacket. His hands, cracked and calloused, moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who handled delicate things in a past life. In his satchel, tucked safely between a cracked thermos and a folded tarp, were 3 items he guarded more fiercely than his own survival: a half-functioning hard drive, a rusted splicer, and a steel reel cutter worn smooth by time. Daniel had a route. Every morning, without fail, he started behind the sushi bar on Melrose, then hit the bins outside the Indie Theater 2 blocks north. He knew which spots yielded Red Bull cans, which ones had tossed out coffee cups with leftover drip worth sipping. But today, he broke the routine. He took a detour toward the south side of the Crossback lot, where trailers and catering trucks parked during large productions. That wasn't part of the plan. He told himself he was just checking for new bins, but the truth was less rational, more instinctual. Something inside him tugged gently at his chest, guiding his feet past the sidewalk cracks and toward the east gate. It had been years since he'd walked this way. The last time he stood near this fence, his name had been printed on the end credits of major studio films. He was the ghost behind the scenes, an archival technician and frame restorer, known for rescuing damaged reels that others gave up on. Daniel had a gift. He could read a single torn frame, like a surgeon reading a CT scan. He could spot splices, warps, burns, and decode them like a second language. His hands once preserved entire decades of American cinema. Now they dug through bags of garbage. As he reached the chain-link barrier that separated the backlot from the city, Daniel crouched near a set of bins behind a row of trailers. He set his satchel down, careful not to jostle the hard drive. The drive hadn't worked right since the battery blew last summer, but he kept it anyway. Inside were the last raw files from a restoration project he'd never finished a cut of a film called The Silent Window, whose lost reels had become a Hollywood myth. He didn't know why he still carried it. Maybe because it was the last proof that he once mattered. Or maybe because somewhere deep down, he still believed someone would care enough to see what was on it. Daniel heard the distant rumble of a truck engine, then a voice through a walkie-talkie. Keanu Reeves was filming today. He froze. The sound of tires crunching over gravel made Daniel shift his position behind the dumpster. A long black SUV rolled slowly past the outer gate, flanked by 2 security golf carts. Even from his distance, Daniel could make out the crew member pointing toward the lot's private access point. The SUV's windows were tinted, but he didn't need to see the man inside to know it was him. Keanu Reeves. Daniel had seen him only once before, years ago, back when he still worked the projection reels at the Archvault facility. Keanu had come in for a private screening with a director whose film was being restored. He had been quiet, respectful, even offered a handshake to the tech team. Daniel had admired him from the shadows of the editing bay, not for his fame, but for the way he paid attention to details most actors ignored. Now here he was again, no longer on the screen, but just a few hundred feet away. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for a flattened soda can at the bottom of the bin. He told himself to focus. He hadn't eaten since yesterday. Focus meant a meal. Focus meant survival. But instead, his eyes drifted back to the trailer entrance, where a small crowd of crew members had started to gather. phones already in hand. Keanu stepped out of the SUV. No fanfare, no entourage. Just him in a black hoodie, jeans, and boots. He gave a small wave to the assistant director, who handed him a script binder. His body language was relaxed, like he didn't realize or didn't care that half the crew was watching him like a constellation had fallen to Earth. Daniel's heart thudded against his ribs. It wasn't just admiration this time. It was something else. Urgency. A strange sensation that made his legs ache with tension. His mind raced back to the hard drive in his satchel. To the footage. To the patch he'd written after hours. The one that stabilized, corrupted film with algorithmic corrections before AI tools ever made headlines. No one knew about it. No one had asked. But Daniel had saved a reel once thought unsalvageable. It had been Keanu's film, The Silent Window. Daniel hadn't even known it was him back then. The footage had come in labeled with just a production code. He hadn't watched the film until months later, long after he'd been fired under false accusations of tampering with restoration logs. But when he finally saw it on an old screen behind a shuttered video rental store, he recognized the patch. His patch. The one that had given the film its most praised scene back. The actor had never known. Daniel swallowed hard. What did it matter now? He was nobody. Just another man with a bag of cans and a broken story. But as he looked at Keanu's silhouette framed by the studio lights, another thought crept into his mind. What if he did know? What if, for once, someone cared? Daniel slowly rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his knees. The hard drive shifted in his bag, heavier than ever. His fingers found the corner of a crumpled dollar bill he'd never spent. It had been meant for emergencies. But maybe this was one. Daniel stepped out from behind the dumpster slowly, like a man approaching the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground beneath him was cracked but walking forward anyway. The lot's outer fencing was 20 yards away, the entrance just beyond that. He kept his head down, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew that eye contact too early would make them nervous. Studio security didn't see people like him as harmless. They saw risk, mess, disruption. He didn't want to cause trouble. He just needed to see Keanu. Even for a moment. Even just to speak one sentence. Maybe he wouldn't remember the silent window. Maybe he'd never heard Daniel's name. Maybe it was all a stretch. But something about today felt different. Like time was folding in on itself. Like maybe this was the last moment Daniel would have to speak before his story vanished completely. A security guard near the gate adjusted his stance as Daniel approached. The man was young, clean-shaven, with a clipboard and a badge radio on his chest. He narrowed his eyes as Daniel got closer, clearly preparing to wave him away. Daniel lifted a hand. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, voice low and calm. The guard looked him up and down. I just want to speak with Mr. Reeves." 1 minute. The guard's expression hardened. No chance. "You can't be here, sir." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, an old receipt with a hand-scribbled note on the back. The digits were the same code he'd once entered into the restoration server the night it failed. He held it up instinctively, even though the guard wouldn't understand. "I helped save his film," Daniel said softly. "Years ago, I was part of the archival team. Please, just." The guard stepped forward. I said, "Move along." Daniel felt his throat tighten. He stepped back instinctively, but then suddenly a voice called from across the lot. "Hold on." The guard turned. Keanu Reeves was walking toward them, script binder still in hand. His gaze locked on Daniel like he was trying to place a memory. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. For a second, no one said anything. The studio behind them went quiet. The moment hung in the air like a scene paused on film. Keanu looked at the guard. "It's okay," he said. "Let him speak." The guard hesitated, then stepped aside. Daniel couldn't believe it. For a second, he wasn't sure if he was dreaming or already waking up behind the dumpsters again. But this was real. He could feel his pulse in his ears. He took a slow breath. And then, with every ounce of dignity he had left, he asked a question that sounded almost too small for its weight. "Mr. Reeves, could you give me $1?" Keanu didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He just looked into Daniel's eyes, really looked, and paused. What happened next would shake the quiet of that backlot, unravel a long-forgotten scandal, and change both of their lives in ways neither man could have imagined. Keanu didn't move for a moment. He just stood there, still holding the script binder, watching Daniel with a calmness that felt almost disarming. The security guard looked from one man to the other, unsure if he should intervene again. But Keanu gave a slight nod, and that was enough. The guard stepped back. Daniel felt exposed. The warmth of Keanu's attention wasn't comforting, yet it was terrifying, like standing in a spotlight after years in the dark. His clothes hung loose over his thin frame, his boots were mismatched, and the frayed strap of his satchel was digging into his shoulder. But he didn't flinch. Not now. Keanu tilted his head slightly. $1? He asked. His voice was gentle, curious, not mocking. There was no trace of judgment in it, but something in his tone made Daniel's throat tighten. Daniel nodded. "Yeah," he said softly, "just one." Keanu lowered the script in his hand and stepped closer. The crowd of crew members near the trailers had started to notice what was happening. A few phones came out discreetly, but Daniel didn't care. He wasn't looking for fame or attention. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. Keanu spoke again. "Why $1? Daniel blinked. Of all the things he expected, dismissal, discomfort, maybe even a quiet donation, it wasn't that. It wasn't a question that needed answering. But suddenly, it felt like everything depended on it. He took a breath. "Most people," he said slowly, "either ignore you or throw coins at you without thinking. Pennies, nickels, whatever they have in their pocket." He looked down at the ground, then back at Keanu. "But $1, it's enough to ask for, but not enough to scare people. It makes them pause. It makes them think." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Think about what?" "About what kind of person they are," Daniel said. "If they reach for a single bill, or if they reach for excuses." A long silence followed. Keanu looked at him with a different kind of focus now. Not just the polite curiosity of a celebrity dealing with an awkward moment, but the deep focus of a man who recognized something strange and familiar in another soul. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure if it was the morning air or the weight of his own words finally catching up with him. Keanu glanced at the satchel on Daniel's shoulder. "What's in the bag?" Daniel instinctively shifted it closer to his side. "Old things," he said. "Stuff I used to work with. Tools. And a drive that doesn't really work anymore." Keanu didn't press further. He didn't need to. Instead, he said something that caught Daniel completely off guard. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" Daniel hesitated. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "Yeah, I would." Keanu turned to the guard. "It's all right. He's with me." Then he looked back at Daniel, and this time, his smile reached all the way to his eyes. "Let's walk." They crossed the lot in silence. Keanu walked with his hands in his hoodie pockets, his pace steady and unhurried. Daniel kept a half step behind him, unsure if he should match his stride or simply follow. It had been years since he'd walked beside someone without feeling like a shadow. The morning sun was just starting to cut through the marine haze, making long streaks of light across the asphalt. A catering truck rumbled in the distance, but here, everything felt still. Keanu led him toward a side exit, one that opened out onto a quieter street behind the sound stages. Just across the street was a small cafe with no signage, just fogged glass and the hum of an espresso machine inside. The kind of place where the Hollywood elite sometimes escaped unnoticed, and the baristas knew better than to ask for selfies. They stepped inside, and the warm smell of coffee hit Daniel like a memory. Roasted beans, steamed milk, cinnamon. For a moment, his eyes closed. He hadn't been in a place like this in so long, he almost forgot what comfort smelled like. Keanu motioned to a corner booth, then stepped up to the counter. "2 coffees, he said. "1 black, one with whatever warms the soul." The barista laughed and nodded. Keanu returned to the table with 2 mugs a few minutes later. No entourage, no fanfare, just 2 men sitting in a booth. Daniel stared at the cup in front of him. His fingers hesitated before wrapping around it. The heat was unfamiliar. His hands had grown used to cold metal, broken plastic, the grit of pavement. Now they held porcelain. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "So," he said gently, "what happened?" Daniel looked up. "What do you mean?" Keanu shrugged. "You don't seem like someone who just gave up. You speak like someone who used to build things, or fix them." Daniel let out a slow breath. He didn't want to open that door. Not yet. But something about Keanu's voice, the genuine interest, the absence of pity, made it easier. "I used to work in film preservation," he said. "Old reels, damaged footage, stuff no one else wanted to touch." Keanu's eyes lit up, just slightly. Daniel continued. "Worked for a place called Archvault Studios, back in the restoration labs. I wasn't on the posters. I wasn't in the credits most of the time. But I kept stories from disappearing." Keanu nodded slowly, processing. "What happened?" Daniel sipped the coffee. It was hot, almost too hot, but he welcomed the sting. "I got blamed for something," he said. "A system crash that cost them a fortune. They needed someone to point to. I was the last one in the room that night, so..." He trailed off. "Lost my job. Lost the apartment. The rest came quick." Keanu's jaw clenched subtly, not with anger, but with understanding. Daniel laughed quietly, the sound rough from years of disuse. "Funny thing is, I patched it. That night, I stayed late and wrote a fix, but they never used it, said it was too risky. Next morning, the whole vault system went down." He looked down at his cup, the steam rising toward his eyes. "And just like that, 20 years of work, gone." Keanu leaned back in the booth. His gaze hadn't moved from Daniel once. "Do you still have it?" he asked. Daniel blinked. "The patch. The fix. Do you still have it?" Daniel hesitated. Then he nodded. "It's in the hard drive," he said. "The one in my bag." Keanu leaned forward, his elbows resting on the edge of the table, the steam from his coffee swirling between them. His voice dropped just slightly, not with secrecy, but with weight. "You kept it all these years?" Daniel's fingers tapped the mug in small, nervous beats. He gave a half shrug. "I couldn't throw it away. Not after what it cost me. Not after all the nights I sat in front of it, hoping maybe someone would ask." Keanu didn't speak. He just let the silence stretch, the kind that made people uncomfortable, but not Daniel. Daniel had lived in silence for years. This was different. This was listening. He set the mug down and reached for his satchel, carefully placing it on the table between them. The strap gave a faint squeak as it slid across the wood. He unzipped it slowly, hands deliberate. Inside, under a threadbare sweatshirt and a spool of magnetic tape, sat a hard drive wrapped in a piece of flannel. He laid it on the table. "It doesn't boot up right," he said. "Not without a specific sequence. The BIOS is corrupted. But the files are still there." Keanu looked at it like it wasn't just a piece of hardware, but a relic. Daniel's voice cracked a little. "I wasn't trying to sabotage anything. I loved that job. I gave everything to it. But they needed a villain, and I didn't fight back hard enough. I just disappeared." A quiet pause. "People like me don't get to make noise. Not in this town." Keanu nodded, still focused on the hard drive. "Do you know," he said, "that the silent window almost didn't get finished?" Daniel's head snapped up. "What?" Keanu gave a small nod. "That film had a state. Massive data loss right before final cut. We lost part of the climax scene. The restoration team sent some version, said it was rebuilt by a miracle patch." He paused. "And it saved the picture." Daniel blinked. "I wrote that patch." Keanu's expression didn't change. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. He flipped to a page filled with scribbled notes, then tapped a line near the middle. "Patch code fragment, echo loop protocol. Hand-labeled frame ghost." Daniel's mouth fell open. "That was my nickname for the tool. It mimics missing frame data using adjacent motion blur patterns." Keanu met his eyes. "I remember that line. It helped rebuild the last 10 minutes of the movie. Critics said it was haunting. That final moment, the silence, the lingering expression that wasn't acting. It was your patch, salvaging broken footage. Daniel swallowed hard. Keanu looked down at the drive again. "You asked for $1, he said softly. "But I think you've already given more than you ever got." Daniel tried to speak, but the lump in his throat stopped him. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill. One crisp dollar. He placed it gently on the table. Then he pushed the coffee closer to Daniel and added quietly, "But maybe today's the day you get something back." Daniel sat frozen, staring at the dollar, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. A door had opened, and for the first time in years, someone was holding it for him. Before everything collapsed, Daniel Rivera used to wear button-down shirts with crisp collars and show up before sunrise to a concrete building in Burbank, marked only with a faded metal plate, Archvault Studios. No public sign, no visitors allowed, just a secure door, a keycard scanner, and rows of underground vaults. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't red carpets or camera flashes. But to Daniel, it was sacred ground. Inside those climate-controlled vaults lived the ghosts of cinema-fragile reels, from the 1,930 seconds, nitrate prints from Europe, rough dailies from forgotten masterpieces. Most people wouldn't recognize the names of the people who shot those films, but Daniel knew every frame. He spent his life giving them breath again. He wasn't just a technician, he was an artist of dust and time. In his early years, he had studied physical film editing, cutting by hand, before transitioning into digital restoration. While other editors bragged about frame rates and timelines, Daniel talked about grain retention and emotional contrast. He didn't just fix pictures, he told stories with the pieces that had been left behind. The turning point came in his 12th year at Archvault. A major client, the parent studio of a young director making waves in indie circles, sent in an urgent emergency request. The director had lost several critical reels due to improper digital backup storage, and with the festival deadline looming, they were desperate. The film was called The Silent Window. Daniel remembered the label on the incoming hard drives. Project SWREELX2. The files were incomplete, corrupted, time codes missing, audio off sync. But underneath the digital static, Daniel saw something remarkable. The footage was raw and powerful. There was one actor in particular whose performance cut through the damaged data like a razor, subtle, restrained, magnetic. Daniel hadn't recognized the name at first. Keanu Reeves. Long before the film gathered traction, long before the studio slapped on an aggressive release campaign, Daniel was sitting in the edit bay, scrubbing through a broken scene where Keanu, in character, stared silently out a hospital window. No music, just breath and light. The file was glitching. Digital tears ran down the screen every few seconds, fragmenting Keanu's expression. Daniel stayed overnight for 4 straight days, writing a custom algorithm, what he would later call the Frame Ghost Protocol. The code rebuilt broken motion data by referencing adjacent frames and inserting micro-sequence blends. It didn't just repair the image, it preserved the emotion. The studio never asked who fixed it. No one ever did. But the final cut included that scene. And critics would later say, it was the moment the film found its soul. Daniel didn't care about credit. Not then. All that mattered was the work. Until it all went wrong. It happened 2 weeks later. Another project, Roseford at Dusk, came in for restoration. A backup server failed mid-transfer. 30 terabytes of master footage vanished. Internal panic spread like wildfire. Executives demanded explanations. Fingers started pointing. And someone Daniel still doesn't know who said his name. He had been the last one in the bay that night. And he had written a dangerous, unauthorized patch. A patch no one had bothered to implement. Daniel remembered sitting across from the Archvault compliance officer, a man named Blake Larimore who wore crisp suits and used phrases like internal exposure risk. The conference room had no windows, no warmth, just a steel pitcher of water and the unshakable feeling that a sentence had already been passed, Blake folded his hands. "The patch you wrote was not authorized." Daniel shook his head. "I stayed late to fix the buffer error. The engineers didn't have time to handle it. I logged my work. The file is in the dev folder. It wasn't cleared. It worked." Blake sighed as if that made things worse, not better. "You bypass standard escalation channels. Your code may have contributed to the system's instability during the Roseford transfer." "That transfer failure had nothing to do with my code," Daniel said. "The issue was in the RAID mirroring. It had been failing for weeks. I warned them." But Blake already had a folder on the table. It contained timestamps, vague flags, and a screenshot of Daniel's commit. No one cared that it was dated before the crash. What they cared about was having someone to point at. The next morning, his badge stopped working. HR told him to collect his things and vacate the premises. By that evening, his company email was deactivated, and all correspondence with legal was routed through a third-party mediator. They never even asked for his side of the story again. Daniel didn't fight it. He couldn't afford to. His savings were already thin, his lease month to month. By the time he found a lawyer willing to review the termination paperwork, he was behind on rent. And once the entertainment blogs picked up the whispers of a security breach involving an Arch Vault technician, no one in the preservation world would return his calls. Within 3 months, his entire identity had been erased, from expert to exile, from craftsman to cautionary tale. He moved into a rundown sublet outside North Hollywood, taking odd repair jobs fixing antique projectors for film students who paid in $20 bills and leftover burritos. He sold his restoration monitor for rent. He sold his editing keyboard for groceries. When his utilities shut off, he packed his bag, grabbed his tools, and walked out the door, without locking it. There was nothing left to protect, except one thing. On the last night in that apartment, Daniel had powered up the corrupted drive that held the backup fragments from the silent window. He knew he wasn't supposed to have it. Technically, it had been erased from the project directory after the patch was applied. But something made him save it anyway. Not out of defiance, but out of reverence. He couldn't prove what he'd done. No one would believe him. But he couldn't let it disappear either. He wrapped it in flannel, tucked it into his satchel with his old splicing tools, and made himself a promise. If no one would remember what he'd done, he would. And maybe one day, someone else would too. Daniel had wandered the streets of Los Angeles for weeks after losing everything, drifting from the alleyways behind studios to the concrete quiet of forgotten side streets. He learned where he could rest without being harassed, where to get coffee poured into a paper cup without being asked too many questions. The city had always moved fast, but now it blurred past him like it didn't even recognize his face. What hurt the most wasn't the hunger or the cold or the looks from people who crossed the street to avoid him. It was the silence. The world had once depended on his eyes, his hands, his ability to see what was broken and bring it back to life. Now no one looked at him long enough to even register he was there. He went days without hearing his name, weeks without speaking more than a sentence. But each night, after the library closed, Daniel would return to the alley behind the laundromat on Highland Avenue. He'd sit cross-legged with his satchel in his lap, powering up the cracked hard drive when he could find an outlet that worked. The screen was scratched, the fan barely turned, but the code was still beautiful. Sometimes he'd pull up the Frame Ghost protocol and just read it, line by line, like a prayer. He knew every line by heart, each loop, each frame blend. It wasn't just a patch, it was a piece of him. He told himself he didn't need redemption. But in his quietest moments, he'd imagine someone on the other end of the industry pipeline noticing. A studio exec looking through archived logs. A director wondering who had saved that impossible scene. A note, a name, a message, but it never came. Years passed. Then one morning, while collecting cans behind the same lot he used to enter with a badge and a clearance code, Daniel overheard a conversation. A grip mentioned Keanu Reeves was shooting scenes for a new indie project on Stage 12. The name struck like thunder. Keanu Reeves, the star of The Silent Window. The man whose face had once glitched and frozen on Daniel's screen before being rescued by Daniel's code. The actor who had unknowingly delivered the performance, Daniel had worked his fingers raw to preserve. It felt like fate. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He just sat behind the library, staring at the hard drive under the glow of a broken streetlight. He didn't know what he was hoping for. A nod? A thank you? Maybe just a moment where someone looked him in the eyes and saw him again, not as a warning, not as a ghost, but as the man he had always been. The next morning, something changed. He woke up earlier than usual, and packed his satchel more carefully than he had in years. He combed his hair with his fingers, straightened his coat, and he walked not to find cans, not to chase warmth, but to walk toward a single question. Just one. Could you give me $1? And maybe, just maybe, the man who had once stood at the edge of a silent window would turn and listen. The morning shoot wrapped with quiet efficiency. Keanu had gone through 2 dialogue-heavy takes and a long tracking shot that followed him down a corridor lit with shifting shadows. The director called, cut, thanked the crew, and told everyone to break for lunch. The camera assistants began reloading equipment. The actors trickled off set. The sun was higher now, making the asphalt on the backlot shimmer faintly. But Keanu's mind wasn't in the studio anymore. He was still thinking about the man at the gate, Daniel Rivera. The name hadn't been spoken, but his face, his posture, his voice when he asked for that $1, those details had stuck to Keanu like sand under the skin. There had been something strange about the whole moment. Not strange in a bad way, but in a way that felt incomplete. Like hearing a song that reminded you of something you couldn't place. Keanu walked back toward the trailers. A wardrobe assistant asked if he wanted lunch brought to his trailer. He nodded, absently, but didn't head there. Instead, he walked toward the studio gate. From across the lot, he could see the security guard speaking to someone through the intercom. The homeless man Daniel wasn't there anymore. Keanu turned, eyes scanning the sidewalk beyond the fence. A block away, he spotted the same worn coat, the satchel, the slow, careful gait of a man who moved through the world expecting to be ignored. Daniel had crossed the street and was now settling near a bus bench, tying one of his bootlaces while balancing the hard drive on his lap. Keanu stood there for a second, unsure why he was still watching. But then he started walking. He passed the crew trailers and crossed the street without saying anything. His boots made soft clicks against the concrete, but Daniel didn't hear him coming until Keanu was already standing nearby. Daniel looked up, surprised but not startled. Keanu held out a paper bag. "I didn't think you'd eaten," he said. "Turkey sandwich, no mustard." Daniel blinked at the bag. He didn't reach for it immediately. "You didn't have to come back." "I know. Why did you?" Keanu sat down at the far end of the bench. Not close enough to crowd him, but not far enough to create distance. He shrugged. "I've seen a lot of people ask for things, but you weren't really asking for money." Daniel gave a dry smile. "No, I wasn't." He accepted the sandwich and held it in his lap like it was a rare object. They sat in silence for a moment. Cars passing behind them on the boulevard, the hum of the city pulsing just beneath the quiet. "I'm not going to make a speech," Keanu said. "And I don't need anything from you. But there's something about what you said about the $1, about how people respond." He looked over at Daniel. "It reminded me of someone I used to work with, a guy in editing who always said, 'You learn the most about people by how they fix broken things.'" Daniel looked down at the hard drive in his lap. "That's all I ever did," he said. "Fix what was broken." Keanu watched him for a long second. "Still do?" Daniel hesitated. "Sometimes, when the library's Wi-Fi is working." Keanu leaned back on the bench, one leg crossed over the other, eyes still on the street ahead. He didn't press for more. He just let the quiet sit there between them like a third person neither of them resented. Daniel slowly unwrapped the sandwich, his hands deliberate, as if he was trying to preserve the paper. He took a bite and chewed slowly, eyes lowering as if embarrassed by the way the food warmed him from the inside. Keanu waited. After a few more bites, Daniel set the sandwich on his lap and spoke, his voice soft. You said editing, he said. You ever lose footage before? Keanu turned to him, brows lifting. Not personally, but I've seen it happen. One time during a small-budget film years ago, the post-production team called us in for reshoots because the main climax scene was corrupted. They said it was gone. Unsalvageable. Daniel's fingers twitched. But then, 2 days later, we were told the footage was magically restored. The editor wouldn't say how, just that someone stepped in and saved it with a patch he couldn't even explain. Keanu paused. The film was The Silent Window. You ever heard of it? Daniel nodded, but he didn't look up. I heard of it. Keanu turned his body slightly now, his voice quieter. That scene, the one where I look out the window near the end, no dialogue critics called it the soul of the film, said it was the stillness that made the movie breathe. Daniel gave a tired smile. It almost didn't exist. Keanu's eyes sharpened. You? Daniel took another bite and nodded slowly as he chewed. I didn't know it was your movie at the time. I just saw a corrupted file come through, with no proper sync. Motion artifacts everywhere. Something about it, I don't know. I stayed late. Built a tool on my own to try and reconstruct the missing frames. Frame Ghost, Keanu said softly. Daniel froze. How do you know that name? It came up in a production note I saw years ago. I never knew what it meant. Daniel let out a quiet breath. It was the name of the protocol I wrote, based on motion, shadow, and gradient recovery. I called it Frame Ghost because it rebuilt what was lost, like echoes left in the light. Keanu looked stunned. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then his eyes moved to the satchel on Daniel's lap. It's in there, isn't it? Daniel nodded. The corrupted reel. The code. Everything I built. It's all in the hard drive. The same one I've been carrying since the day they fired me. Keanu's expression changed. Not in a dramatic way, but subtly, meaningfully. He was no longer seeing Daniel as someone down on his luck. He was seeing him like a puzzle piece that had been missing from a story all along. Daniel took another sip of the lukewarm coffee Keanu had brought earlier and wiped his hands on the side of his coat. I didn't want to tell anyone, he said. Not because I was hiding, but because when you've been accused of something you didn't do long enough, you start thinking maybe your story doesn't matter anymore. Keanu leaned forward now, elbows on his knees. It matters. Daniel looked at him. Keanu didn't flinch. I remember that scene, Daniel. And if what you're saying is true, then the reason that film worked at all, the reason I looked good in it is because of you. Daniel didn't respond. He just looked down at his hands, those same hands that once handled reels like relics, and for the first time in years, didn't feel ashamed. The coffee in Daniel's cup had gone cold, but neither of them seemed to notice. Outside, the lunch rush had picked up. A few crew members walked past the cafe's windows, not realizing the man they'd seen on set an hour ago was now sitting in a booth with a stranger who looked like he didn't belong. But Keanu didn't glance away once. Daniel shifted slightly, his voice lower now, more hesitant. There was a moment, right after the studio let me go, when I almost threw the drive away. It was sitting in my hand, right over a trash bin behind the bus depot. I'd just been turned down by a job that didn't even pay minimum wage. He paused. I told myself I was letting go of the past, but I couldn't do it. Keanu nodded. Because it wasn't just data, it was proof. Daniel looked up. Proof I was more than the accusation, he said. Proof I had done something good, that I had seen something no one else did and brought it back from the dead. There was a long silence. Then Keanu asked quietly, what if I told you I'm working on something right now that needs that same kind of eye? Daniel blinked. What do you mean? A small documentary project, Keanu said. Something personal, something about memory, loss, restoration. I've been gathering footage, old behind-the-scenes reels, interviews, scraps from films that never got finished. He tapped a finger gently on the table. We've hit a wall with some of it. Damaged audio, corrupted frames, things most editors don't even want to touch. Daniel stared at him, unsure whether to believe what he was hearing. Keanu continued, I'm not offering you a job. Not yet. I'm not even sure what this island, but I am. Saying if you still have that patch, if you still know how to do what you once did. He gestured toward the satchel. Then maybe this isn't the end of your story. Daniel leaned back slightly, stunned. You want me to work on your film? I want to see what you can do, Keanu said. No promises, just possibility. Daniel looked down at the hard drive, the edge of the flannel wrap peeking out from the zipper. He had guarded that thing like a life raft through a storm. Now it sat between them like an unopened invitation. He finally exhaled. I'd need time, a clean system, a place to work. Keanu nodded. I can give you that, and a little faith. You already earned it, Keanu said. Daniel's mouth twitched almost a smile, but not quite. It was too soon for that. But the weight in his chest didn't feel as suffocating anymore. Keanu stood slowly. I've got to get back on set, he said. But I meant what I said. I'll have my assistant call the cafe tomorrow. Leave your name. We'll set up a meeting. You'll have a clean room, clean gear, no judgment. He paused. But only if you want it. Daniel nodded slowly. I do. Keanu offered his hand. Daniel hesitated, then took it. It was a short shake. Simple. But to Daniel, it felt like the first time in years someone had reached in, not just out. As Keanu turned to leave, he stopped by the door and looked back. Daniel, he said. Yeah? That scene in the silent window, it changed how I see silence. Daniel's eyes flickered. Then I guess the patch worked. The following morning, Daniel waited outside the cafe before the sun had even risen. He hadn't slept much, just a few scattered hours behind the library wall, his coat wrapped tight around him, the hard drive cradled against his chest like a relic. He didn't know what to expect. Maybe Keanu wouldn't come back. Maybe it had just been a moment of kindness, a passing gesture. But something told him otherwise. At exactly 8:15, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The passenger side window rolled down, and a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard leaned toward him. Daniel Rivera? He stood, clutching his satchel. Yes. Mr. Reeves asked me to take you to the soundstage. We've arranged a private screening room for the morning. You'll have time to work and meet with him later this afternoon. Daniel nodded, stunned. The ride to the lot was quiet, but not awkward. The woman, whose name was Vera, didn't ask invasive questions. She handed him a tablet with a non-disclosure agreement and pointed to a stylus. He signed without hesitation. When they arrived, she led him down a back corridor that opened into a compact but modern editing suite. A room with 3 monitors, blackout curtains, high-fidelity speakers, and a workstation cleaner than anything Daniel had seen in years. A hot cup of coffee steamed on the corner of the desk. Take your time, Vera said. Mr. Reeves will join you after his morning block. And then she left him alone. Daniel stared at the setup for a long moment. It felt like entering a cathedral, built for second chances. He unzipped his satchel, unwrapped the flannel from around the drive, and stared at the metal casing. It was scuffed, dented, the corners worn from years of being packed and repacked in alleyways and shelters, but it still held everything. The protocol, the logs, the truth. He took a breath, plugged it in, and waited. The machine blinked once, then again. Then, the desktop flickered to life. Within minutes, he was back in a world he thought he'd left behind. Command prompts, raw file structures, hashed backups, restoration layers. His fingers moved with practiced rhythm, even as his chest tightened. He didn't know how long it would take for Keanu to arrive, but he knew exactly what he needed to show him. The folder was labeled Crash, Logs, 2016. Inside were 10 files, some technical, some personal. One of them, a plain text document named Failed Protocol 3A, had never been opened by anyone else until now. He clicked it. The screen filled with lines of code, but beneath them was a message written by Daniel on the night he was fired. It read, "If you're reading this, it means someone finally looked deeper than the headlines. I didn't crash the system. I saved it. The patch was written, tested, and approved by our internal QA team, but it was never deployed. Not because it was faulty, because it didn't come from the right person. I was told to back off. I didn't, so they made me the villain. The truth is in the logs. The timestamps don't lie. Daniel stared at the words. He had forgotten he'd written them. He had never expected anyone to see them. Behind him, the door opened. Keanu stepped in quietly, holding 2 mugs. "You still take it black?" he asked. Daniel didn't turn around. His voice was steady. "I'm about to tell you something that nobody believed. Not then. Maybe not now." Keanu set the mugs down gently. "Try me." Daniel pulled the rolling chair a little closer to the screen. The glow of the monitor lit the lines under his eyes. He tapped the spacebar, and a video log opened. It was grainy security footage from inside the Archvault editing bay. The timestamp in the corner read 02, 12 amperes. M, November 3rd, 2016. "That's me," Daniel said quietly. That night, Keanu watched as the flickering footage showed Daniel pacing the small room, his coat still on, moving between a laptop and a server rack. The angle was bad. The audio was missing. But it was clear he wasn't panicking, he was working. "I was finishing the patch," Daniel said. The servers had been red flagged for months. There was a known issue with the cache flow into the RAID controller. I wrote a stabilizer, a temporary workaround that would give them time to do a full system overhaul. He clicked a second file. A log opened, filled with time entries, notes, confirmation checks. "They never ran it," Daniel said. "The morning after I submitted the protocol, the crash happened. Whole sections of the archive were lost. But not because of what I did, because they ignored the patch and pushed a forced sync during a maintenance cycle." He pulled up a third file. This one showed a direct Slack message from one of the junior engineers at the time. "Hey, I think your patch works, but Blake says not to use anything that hasn't been cleared by ops. Sorry, man. Politics." Keanu stepped closer, eyes moving across the lines. "Blake, that's the guy you mentioned at the cafe?" Daniel nodded. "Director of Risk Management. Always wore cologne that made your eyes water." Keanu's jaw tightened slightly. Daniel continued. "They needed someone to blame. Someone who didn't fight back, who didn't have a title big enough to get lawyers involved. I had been there over a decade, but no one at the executive level even knew my name." He paused, fingers tightening on the mouse. "My badge stopped working 2 days later. No severance, no statement, just silence, like I had never existed." Keanu was quiet, absorbing every word. "I tried to tell the truth," Daniel said, "to anyone who'd listen. But once the trade blogs ran with the phrase internal breach, it was over. I became the story, the disgruntled technician, the failure. Even friends I had worked with for years stopped picking up the phone." He turned slowly to Keanu now, face lined with the weight of years. And the worst part wasn't losing the job. Or the home. It wasn't even being hungry. Keanu waited. It was knowing I had saved something. That I had written the fix. That the silent window survived because I stayed up 4 nights in a row to build something beautiful and no one would ever know. He looked back at the screen, where a single file still sat open. "That's what haunted me." Keanu said nothing for a moment. Then his voice came low. "Not anymore." Daniel looked at him, startled. Keanu nodded at the screen. "Now someone knows." Keanu stepped closer to the desk, the hum of the hard drive the only sound in the room for a long moment. He leaned over and scrolled through the logs Daniel had just opened. The dates matched. The entries were clear. Every change Daniel had made was time-stamped before the crash. Not after, not during, before. "This isn't a cover-up file," Keanu murmured. "It's a roadmap," Daniel nodded. But no one wanted to read it. They saw a low-level name and a messy narrative. Easier to blame the guy who wasn't on the Christmas card list. Keanu shook his head slowly, still looking at the code. And this patch, the Frame Ghost protocol, it wasn't just a one-time thing? "No," Daniel said. "It was meant to be scalable. I designed it for real damage, but it works for almost any kind of frame data loss, digital or analog. That's why the silent window could be salvaged when everyone thought it was gone. It didn't just fix the footage, it reinterpreted it. Like reconstructing a memory through emotional rhythm instead of logic, Keanu took a deep breath and sat in the second chair. "I had no idea," he said. "Of course not," Daniel replied. "No one did. That's how erasure works. They don't tell people. They just stop mentioning you." He glanced down at his hands. "After a while, you start doing the same thing to yourself." Keanu looked at him, a heaviness forming in his chest. He remembered that final scene in the silent window, the one people still quoted back to him years later. He remembered the raw silence, the way it felt like time paused for just a breath. The director had told him it was all him, that his acting had made the scene immortal. But now, sitting across from Daniel, Keanu saw the fuller picture. It hadn't just been his face on screen. It had been Daniel's invisible hands behind the screen guiding the pixels, coaxing life back into broken frames. "You saved that film," Keanu said. Daniel gave a half smile. "I saved a moment. The rest was you." Keanu looked at him, then slowly shook his head. "No," he said. "That moment was us, and no one gave you credit. No one even looked." Daniel didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted to the monitors, to the log files that had sat dormant for years, waiting for someone to care. "I didn't want fame," he said. "Just fairness. And you deserve it," Keanu replied. He stood and walked to the far wall, looking out the small, shaded window. The soundstage outside was quiet. Lunch hour. Stillness between scenes. "When a story's been told wrong," he said, "it leaves behind a residue. People can feel it, even if they don't know why." He turned back to Daniel. "Yours was told wrong, and I think it's time we retell it." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How?" Keanu picked up the hard drive, turned it in his hand, then carefully set it back down on the table. "Start by showing the world what they missed." He took a slow breath. "And then we make sure your name is on it this time." Daniel's eyes flickered. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, he wasn't asking for anything anymore. He was being invited back. 2 days later, just after midnight, Daniel stood in front of the rusting gate of Archvault Studios, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He hadn't been here in over 6 years. Not since the night he lost everything. The building was still standing, but the signs were gone. The entry keypad was cracked. The outer security lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the perimeter wall. Beside him, Keanu adjusted the strap on the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He wore a black hoodie pulled low, the same boots from the set, and a look of cautious determination. "You sure about this?" Daniel asked. Keanu nodded. "If the footage you talked about is still inside, it's time someone saw it." Daniel looked at the side alley just like he remembered. "We'll have to go around." The front panel was disabled when they gutted the building for that renovation that never happened. They moved quickly and quietly along the side of the building, sticking close to the shadows. The alley smelled of damp concrete and old oil, the same as it had years ago. Daniel reached a rusted service door with a keypad still barely intact. He brushed his hand over it, wiping away a thin film of dust. "This was mine," he said. "I built this system when they added the lower vault, meant to keep interns from wondering where they shouldn't." Keanu watched as Daniel pulled out a tiny flashlight from his coat pocket. He flicked it on, illuminating the worn keypad. "I left a backdoor override, in case I ever got locked out." He tapped in a sequence slowly. "It's not in the logs. No one knew it existed but me." 4 beeps, then a low click. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was stale and cold. They stepped into a narrow maintenance corridor that led to a stairwell covered in peeling paint. Emergency lights on the wall cast a faint red hue, barely enough to see. Daniel led the way down. They reached a sub-level that still had the remnants of the old server bay's empty metal racks, disconnected cables, dusty patch panels. It was like walking through the bones of something once alive. Keanu looked around. his voice low. "This place feels forgotten." Daniel nodded. "That was always the risk. When you spend your life preserving memories, no one thinks to preserve you." At the end of the hall was a locked panel covered in faded yellow caution tape. Daniel crouched and pried it open with a tool from his coat pocket. Behind it was a circuit interface, a set of analog switches, manual overrides for the backup generator. He flipped 2 of them in sequence. A hum began to rise from beneath the floor. Then a sharp click. The lights flickered. Daniel stepped back. "It's alive!" A control screen on the far wall buzzed faintly and powered on. He crossed the room, tapped the screen, and waited. "Come on," he whispered. "Still be here." Keanu stepped beside him as a directory loaded. At the top was a folder labeled Arch, Silent, Window, Real, 4X, Unedited, Backup. Daniel stared at it, breath caught in his throat. "It's here," he whispered. "Is that the lost scene?" Keanu asked. Daniel clicked the file. A loading bar appeared. Then the screen cut to black, and from the darkness, a face emerged. His face, Keanu Reeves. A scene no one had seen in 6 years. The screen flickered, then steadied. There he was, younger, weathered by character makeup, blood on his shirt, eyes red from a scene that demanded everything. It was the final monologue from The Silent Window, a psychological drama that Keanu remembered filming under the harsh pressure of a closing production window. But the final cut, the one that had been released, had replaced this ending with a silent fade-out and vague narration. No one ever explained why, not even the director. But now the raw truth was unfolding in grainy resolution before them. In the footage, Keanu's character stood on the edge of a hospital rooftop, wind whipping through his shirt, city lights shimmering in the background. He looked broken, but somehow composed. There was a heaviness in the moment, something deeply human. He was saying goodbye, not just to a loved one, but to a life he no longer recognized. Keanu leaned forward, watching himself on the screen. His younger voice cracked with emotion. "You think the world gives second chances, but I don't think it does. I think the window closes the moment we stop looking through it." Then came a pause. The version the world had seen had cut here, but this version continued. "I didn't fall. I stepped away, and I kept walking. I chose the fire escape instead of the edge, because even broken glass catches the light." Daniel glanced sideways, watching Keanu process the scene in silence. There was a stillness in him now, not just nostalgia, but something deeper. Recognition. A moment he thought was lost forever. "Why did they cut this?" Keanu asked softly. Daniel's reply came slowly. "Too raw, too vulnerable. The test audiences said it left them feeling unsettled. The studio didn't want ambiguity. They wanted something that looked clean on a poster." Keanu nodded without speaking. His jaw was tight. His eyes never left the screen. When the scene ended, the file directory returned. The backup contained multiple takes. Behind the scenes, B-roll. Notes from the original editor, all marked Archvault locked. The data had survived all these years in a hidden server no one had ever shut down properly. Daniel exhaled, stepping back like a man who had just opened a time capsule. "I tried to tell them," he murmured, "that it wasn't a crash, that I patched the system before anything got wiped. But they needed someone to blame. They blamed you because you were invisible," Keanu said. "They thought no one would notice." Daniel chuckled bitterly. "That's how studios work. When everything runs perfectly, no one asks why. But the moment something goes wrong, they look for the guy who isn't on the posters." Keanu reached out and gently touched the console, as if grounding himself to the moment. "This scene," he said, voice low, "was the best work I did in that film." Daniel gave a faint nod. "I know." Keanu turned to him slowly. "And you saved it." Daniel didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Keanu stood still for a long moment, letting the weight of it all settle. Then he spoke. "We need to get this out." Daniel's head lifted slightly. "Out? As in, released?" Keanu nodded. "People need to see what really happened. That scene changed the meaning of the whole film. It gave it soul. They buried it. Daniel hesitated. It's not just about uploading a file. That footage is technically studio property. Archvault might be gone, but their catalog lives on through their parent company. Touch that, and we open a legal minefield. Keanu glanced at the stack of old reels, then back at the humming server. Let me deal with that. I'll call my agent, my legal team. There's power in truth, and sometimes you just need one voice loud enough to make people uncomfortable. Daniel looked at him, the disbelief softening into something like trust. You'd really go to bat for this? I'd go to bat for you, Keanu said. You kept this alive when no one else did. You carried a burden that wasn't yours, and now it's time people knew. The words caught Daniel off guard. He looked down, then slowly leaned back against the wall. Funny. All these years I thought maybe I made it up. That maybe I imagined saving it. That maybe none of it mattered. It did, Keanu said gently. It matters right now. Outside, the night was thick and still. The lot remained empty. The world hadn't changed, but inside that old editing vault, 2 lives had just shifted course. Keanu grabbed a copy of the drive, slipping it into a secure pouch from the gear bag he'd carried. I'll start the process tomorrow. Quietly. Daniel raised a brow. You sure you want to get involved in all this? Keanu turned toward. They took your name from the credits. They erased your role in history. But I remember now. And I'm not letting it end like that. Daniel didn't reply. But in the silence that followed, something long dormant inside him flickered back to life. A sense of belonging, of being seen. And as they quietly stepped out of the vault, slipping back into the shadows of the lot, the old studio lights above them buzzed faintly, one last time, like a curtain rising again after years of silence. Section complete. The next morning, the air was sharp and clean, sunlight cutting through a silver haze that still lingered over Los Angeles. Keanu sat quietly at the edge of a small park bench, not far from the diner where he had first shared a coffee with Daniel. His thoughts drifted back to the vault, the reels, and the man who had once been invisible to the world, now illuminated in full color. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, satchel slung over one shoulder. The bag looked even older in the daylight frayed canvas, corners torn, the strap stitched in places with mismatched thread. It was the kind of thing most people would have tossed away, but Daniel treated it like it was sacred. Keanu offered a small nod. You always carry that with you? Daniel shrugged. It's what I've got left. Keanu leaned forward. Can I see what's inside? There was a long pause. Daniel clutched the satchel tighter for a moment, then slowly placed it on the bench between them. With careful hands, he unclipped the rusted buckle and peeled open the flap. The contents were unlike anything Keanu expected. Spools of 16mm and 35mm film were coiled in tight circles, some in plastic cases, others wrapped delicately in layers of wax paper. A magnifying loupe sat in a corner pouch, next to a hand-cranked viewer. There were pages, dozens of them, filled with sketches, restoration notes, time codes written in black pen, and arrows pointing to moments Daniel had deemed critical to emotional continuity. One reel, wrapped tightly in old flannel, had a handwritten label, Scene 14, Alt Ending, Do Not Lose. Keanu lifted it gently, letting the flannel fall away. His fingers brushed the edge of the film. You kept all this, Keanu said softly. I didn't know what else to do, Daniel replied. These weren't just projects to me. They were lives, hours, decades. People putting everything they had into telling the truth, or at least trying to. You can't just let that die. Keanu studied a strip of film against the sundae. It shimmered faintly, its images too small to see clearly, but he could tell there was story there. You did more than save files, Keanu said. You preserved memory, emotion, integrity. Daniel shrugged, but there was a flicker of pride behind his eyes. Then Keanu looked directly at him. You ever think about going back into the editing world? Daniel laughed, a dry rasp of disbelief. Me? No studio would touch me. I'm a ghost with a bad reputation and a box of old reels. Keanu smiled. I'm not a studio. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside was a simple treatment draft. Notes for a short film Keanu had been quietly developing, personal, quiet, something reflective about loss and rediscovery. He placed it gently on Daniel's lap. I want you to work on something with me. Daniel stared down at the envelope on his lap like it was a live wire. He didn't touch it right away. His fingers hovered over the crease, uncertain, not just of the contents, but of what it meant. Is this a pity offer? He asked, his voice steady but low. Keanu shook his head. If it was, I'd have handed you a check and disappeared. I'm offering you a partnership, not charity. Daniel's hands finally moved, slow and deliberate. He opened the envelope and pulled out the pages. His eyes scanned the lines quickly at first, then slower. His breath caught when he reached a section labeled Editor's Notes to be developed collaboratively. He blinked a few times, reading that line again. You wrote this with someone in mind, Daniel murmured. I wrote it with you in mind, Keanu said. Even before I knew who you were. Daniel looked up. Why? Keanu leaned back slightly on the bench. Because for years, there were scenes in my films that felt like magic. Little moments that somehow hit deeper than they should have. I never knew who was behind them, just knew someone was taking what I did on screen and turning it into something more human, more honest. And now, I think I know who that someone was. Daniel's throat tightened. It wasn't just me, he whispered. There were other people, sound mixers, colorists, old school cutters who stayed late when no one asked them to. But yeah, I left fingerprints. Keanu nodded. You left fingerprints on my life. You don't even know it. For a while, they sat in silence. Cars passed. A distant siren wailed and faded. A dog barked across the street. But between them, nothing moved but the wind. I'm not what I used to be, Daniel said finally. I don't have a machine anymore. No software. No studio badge. I don't need a badge, Keanu replied. I need someone who still believes that every cut has a soul. You're that guy. Daniel looked down at his hands. They were rough, lined with age and street grit, but still steady. His right thumb bore a deep old scar, a reminder of a splicing blade from years ago. He chuckled under his breath. You don't even know if I can still handle a timeline. Keanu stood up and offered a hand. Let's find out. Daniel looked at the hand. For a moment, the world stilled. Then, slowly, he reached up and clasped it. The grip was firm, warm, real. As they walked together toward Keanu's car, Daniel's satchel bounced lightly against his hip, the reels inside whispering promises of unfinished stories, stories waiting for a second chance. He had no idea where this would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was going somewhere. They drove in silence at first. Keanu kept his eyes on the road, the hum of the engine filling the gaps between thoughts. Daniel rested the satchel on his lap, one hand protectively cradling it, like an old friend he wasn't ready to let go of. The reels inside were more than film. They were proof he hadn't imagined who he was. You still have your own place? Daniel asked softly, as if the question itself felt too presumptuous. Keanu smiled gently. Yeah, but the edit bay's not at my house. I've got a small post-production space I rent downtown. Quiet, private, you'll like it. Daniel gave a skeptical nod. I haven't touched pro equipment in almost 15 years. Hope your timeline forgives me. I'm not hiring you to be perfect, Keanu replied. I'm asking you to care. They parked in a nondescript brick building surrounded by coffee shops and tattoo parlors. A keypad-controlled door led into a narrow hallway. Keanu punched in a code. The lock clicked. Inside was a modest editing suite, clean but humble. A couple of vintage Steenbecks in the corner, dual-screen monitors on a desk, and acoustic foam lining the walls. Nothing flashy, just focused. Daniel stepped inside, like a man entering a temple. He ran his fingers across the control panels, the reel cases, the splicing table. His hands seemed to wake up. muscle memory returning in small waves. He inhaled the faint scent of plastic, dust, and electricity. "Still smells the same," he said with a half smile. Keanu didn't interrupt. He let Daniel have the moment. Daniel set the satchel on the table and unzipped it with care. Out came a faded cloth-wrapped reel labeled "The Silent Window Original Final Scene, Alt Take 3." Then a thick notebook filled with yellowing pages and margin scribbles, diagrams, scene lengths, dialogue timings in pencil and pen. He opened the notebook to a specific page, circled in red ink. "This is the one they cut," he said, "because the original digital scan crashed. They didn't know I kept a reel-to-reel backup." "You think it still plays?" Keanu asked. Daniel glanced up, only one way to find out. He walked over to the reel-to-reel player, threading the film with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. His fingers moved like a craftsman. Each flick, pull, and turn was precise, like tuning a delicate instrument. He adjusted the lamp, checked the heads, and held his breath as he pressed play. The screen lit up. There was Keanu, 20 years younger, standing in the rain, whispering a line that had never made it into the final cut. Daniel watched it with glistening eyes. Keanu didn't say a word, because he recognized it too, the heartbeat of a scene that had waited decades to be heard. Daniel stood in front of the building with his satchel slung over his shoulder. It had been years since he'd stepped into anything resembling a professional studio. The concrete steps felt heavy beneath his boots, but Keanu's quiet encouragement gave him the push to move forward. Inside was a modern production house, sleek, clean, filled with the low hum of editing bays and coffee machines. Keanu guided him through the hallways with casual confidence, nodding at familiar faces, while Daniel tried to absorb the change in atmosphere. It wasn't fear he felt, it was the weight of being seen again. In a sunlit conference room, 3 people waited. Leslie Tran, a sharp-eyed archival supervisor. Javier Romero, a senior producer with decades of film under his belt. And Mei Chen, a rising digital restoration expert known for her fast work and faster skepticism. They all looked up when Daniel entered. Keanu introduced him without embellishment. "This is Daniel Blake. He's the reason you're seeing the final scene of The Silent Window today." Javier leaned back in his chair. "Heard of you. You used to be a legend in offline edit rooms." May crossed her arms. "Used to be." Daniel didn't flinch. "Still am. Just needed a long intermission." Leslie smirked slightly at the comeback, but her tone stayed neutral. "We'll see." Keanu nodded toward the table, where a mangled film reel sat inside a metal canister. The tape looked brittle. It was warped at the edges, spliced in places with duct tape, and the label had half faded into oblivion. "This was pulled from a flood-damaged archive upstate," Leslie said. "It's from a 1974 independent documentary called Steel Hearts. Only one reel survived. It's been considered unrecoverable," May added. "We've thrown everything at it. Nothing stable enough to even digitize. We figured if you're serious, you can try this." Daniel studied the reel without touching it yet. He looked up. "Time limit?" Javier glanced at his watch. 4 hours. "And we need something we can actually show on screen. Not just a playable scan." Daniel nodded once. Keanu pulled out a key card and handed it to Daniel. "Suite 3 is yours. Everything you need is in there." He didn't say good luck. He didn't need to. Daniel turned to the team. "I'll return it to you better than it was made." No one replied. That was part of the test. Inside the suite, Daniel took a deep breath and opened the reel gently. The smell of mildew and aged film hit his nose immediately. He powered up the equipment, calibrating the lamp temperature and cleaning the rollers. Then he began. He clipped the starting frame and ran a clean scan for reference. As the scan rendered, he opened his notebook, the same one he had carried for years. He scribbled notes, timestamps, and frame ratios, cross-checking them against edge codes he spotted with a magnifying glass. His process was old school, intuitive, but it worked. The footage sputtered to life on the monitor. Shadows and blotches riddled the image. Sound was missing entirely. But Daniel saw through the chaos. He always had. Where others saw noise, he saw structure. Where others gave up, he dissected. Using waveform analysis, he tracked audio remnants hidden beneath the damaged visual data. He layered color correction curves by hand, not relying on presets. Then he rebuilt each corrupted frame using interlaced reference imagery and interpolation techniques. He'd pioneered back in the 90 seconds techniques, forgotten in today's plug-in generation. Outside the suite, time ticked by slowly. The team sat in the lounge, glancing at the wall clock, occasionally peering toward the closed editing room. Keanu stood quietly by the window, arms folded, saying nothing. He didn't need to defend Daniel. He just needed them to witness. At hour 3, May stood up and paced. Even if he gets it running, I doubt it'll be clean. The grain's probably embedded too deep. Leslie said nothing, but her brow furrowed in thought. At hour 4, the door to the suite opened. Daniel stepped out, holding a slim drive in his hand. "Reel's back where it belongs. You'll want to see this." He didn't look triumphant. He looked calm, centered, like someone who had simply remembered who he was. They loaded the footage into the projector bay. The lights dimmed. As the screen flickered to life, a hush fell over the room. Black and white images emerged steelworkers from the 1,970 seconds, sweat pouring down their brows, faces illuminated by welding sparks. Then color seeped into the edges, carefully restored, not oversaturated. The grime remained, but the spirit of the image was alive. You could feel it. A man on the screen paused to light a cigarette with trembling fingers. Another knelt to kiss a photograph of his child before stepping into the steel press. The audio returned gravelly interviews of long-dead workers, remastered and layered with care. There were sighs in the room as a narrator's voice, thought lost forever, returned in full clarity, his monologue echoing, "This isn't just heat and iron. This is what holds the bones of the country together." The film ran for 4 minutes. When it ended, no one spoke. Javier leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You rebuilt the chroma structure manually?" Daniel nodded. "Used old charts to map the decay curve, then resynced the base using frame bleed. The audio was trickier. I separated the static layers, then rebuilt the decay. Low end using ghost waveforms. Took a few liberties, but the heart's intact." May blinked. "That technique's, I've only ever read about it." Daniel's voice was gentle. "I wrote those papers." Keanu smiled softly. Leslie finally broke the silence. "We had 5 interns and 2 professionals try to restore this over 3 months. You did more in 4 hours than all of them combined." Javier stood and extended a hand. "I'm sorry for doubting you. That was remarkable." Daniel shook his hand, nodding once, his fingers still trembling slightly from the intensity of the work. Then Keanu turned to the room. "He's not here for a test anymore. He's here to work. With us." No one objected. May looked at Daniel. "Do you have more techniques like that? Ones you haven't published?" Daniel opened his satchel and pulled out a slim folder filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, and decade-old drafts of ideas that had never seen daylight. "I have dozens." Leslie took the folder delicately, flipping through it like she was holding a lost gospel. Keanu placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Welcome back." Daniel didn't smile outwardly, but his eyes, those tired, sharp, observant eyes, brightened. After years of erasure, after living beneath the radar, sleeping beside dumpsters and beneath overpasses, the room finally saw him. Not as a relic, not as a footnote, but as the master he had always been. The footage restoration had been nothing short of a revelation, but the impact of Daniel's return didn't stay within the quiet walls of Keanu's studio. Word spread like wildfire. It started with a whisper on a film editor's forum. Someone posted stills of the restored 1,970 seconds reel, tagging it, "Unbelievable, old school magic. Guess who did this?" Within hours, production assistants, editors, and even veteran archivists were reposting, speculating. Then, a grainy photo of Daniel walking beside Keanu in the studio parking lot appeared online. By morning, industry blogs had picked it up. Keanu Reeves, seen with formerly blacklisted editor Daniel Whitaker, "What's going on?" Then came the call from Archvault Studios. Keanu was in the middle of reviewing a remastering plan for The Silent Window when Javier walked in, holding a phone. "They want to meet," he said. Keanu didn't even glance up. "Good. Schedule it." Javier raised an eyebrow. "With Daniel?" Keanu finally looked up. "Of course. He doesn't get left out of this. Not again." They set the meeting for Friday morning. A corner conference room at the Archvault lot. Daniel arrived in a neatly pressed shirt that looked like it hadn't been worn in a decade, sleeves rolled up just slightly at the cuffs. His hands twitched nervously at first. The muscle memory of someone who'd spent years hiding, expecting judgment in every glance. Keanu walked beside him. No entourage, no sunglasses, just quiet purpose. Inside the room were 5 executives, faces Daniel hadn't seen in 20 years. Some had aged out of their arrogance. Others wore the same smugness they always had. Dean Karsten, now VP of Content Archives, opened the conversation without even sitting down. "We didn't expect you." Daniel offered a short nod. "Neither did I." Keanu stepped forward. "You made a mistake, a public one, and I'm here to help you correct it." One of the others, Marcia Levine, frowned. "Mr. Reeves, this isn't about you." "It is now," Keanu replied calmly. He laid a slim folder on the table. Inside were 2 things: a printed backup log showing the last edit of the Silent Window reels and Daniel's original handwritten restoration notes, preserved from decades ago. The timestamps matched. The log showed Daniel had saved the original cut 2 days before the footage disappeared. And most importantly, the deletion had occurred not from Daniel's terminal, but from an admin account belonging to someone else entirely. Someone who was no longer with the company. Karsten squinted at the paper. "Where did you get this?" Keanu's voice was even. "From your old servers. They weren't as wiped as you thought." Daniel leaned forward. "I didn't steal anything. I didn't tamper with the negatives. I backed them up. I followed procedure. The person who deleted them had the authority and the access. I didn't." For a moment, no one said anything. The silence was heavier than any outburst could have been. Levine's fingers tapped against her legal pad. "So you're saying we falsely accused you?" "I'm not saying it. Your logs are." Karsten shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. "Then what do you want from us? Money? A settlement?" Daniel looked toward Keanu, then back at the executives. "I want the truth. Publicly. I want the retraction," Keanu added. "And I want your team to issue it with the same energy you used when you smeared him." Karsten scoffed. "It's been 20 years. No one cares anymore." Keanu didn't blink. "They will." The tension in the room didn't break. It shifted. Marcia leaned forward now, flipping through the folder again. Her eyes scanned Daniel's notes with something approaching respect. She finally sighed. "The worst part island. I remember this. I remember seeing these notes in the archives department years ago. But no one wanted to speak up. The story had already been sold to the press." Daniel's voice was soft. "I lost my home because of that story. I lost my family. My name. All I ever wanted was to fix film, not become a headline." Karsten folded his arms. "We still have a brand to protect." Keanu stood, the chair legs scraping the floor just enough to make everyone look up. "So do I." He took out his phone and placed it gently on the table. "You have until tomorrow, because if I don't see a retraction, I'll be reading this story myself, in every outlet that covers me. I'll talk about what happened to Daniel, what it cost him, and what you did to a man who never fought back until now." Marcia glanced at Karsten. "If we issue a statement, it'll raise questions. Questions about past mismanagement." Keanu didn't smile. "Then you better answer them honestly." That was the end of the meeting. Within hours, Daniel received an email with a draft apology. It was short, but clear. Archvault Studios acknowledged their mishandling of archival evidence, their wrongful termination of Daniel Whitaker, and their regret over how his name had been tarnished. They admitted they had not done a thorough investigation and that new findings vindicated Daniel completely. By the next morning, the apology had gone public. The industry buzzed like it hadn't in years. Film restoration groups, online forums, Twitter threads, everywhere people were talking about the editor who had been pushed out and now restored to dignity. But it wasn't just film people. A major entertainment magazine ran a cover story with Daniel's photo shot from that morning, just outside the Archvault gates. Keanu had insisted a friend photographer be there. The headline read, "From Dumpster to Director's Chair, the Comeback of Daniel Whitaker." The subheading was even more powerful, "Wrongfully Accused, Forgotten by Hollywood." Until Keanu Reeves gave him the one thing no one else would believe. Daniel stared at the Pratt article, printed and held in his hands like it was something sacred. His fingers shook, not from cold or exhaustion, from the sudden, overwhelming weight of it all. Keanu walked in, coffee in hand. "Saw it?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I'm still processing." Keanu smiled. "You're not the only one. My inbox is full of people asking about you. Old colleagues, journalists, even a few directors." Daniel laughed under his breath. "You serious?" As a reshoot at sunset. They were back in Keanu's editing suite. The door closed to the noise of the outside world. Daniel stood in front of the long work table, silent. His fingers hovered over an old metal film canister, the kind with rust curling at the edges and a faded handwritten label. Keanu watched him, patient. Daniel finally said, "I haven't opened this since the night everything fell apart." He slowly cracked open the lid. The scent of old film and dust floated out. Inside, carefully packed beneath the black celluloid reel, was a folded envelope, yellowed at the corners, unsealed, but clearly aged by time and grief. Keanu leaned closer. "What is it?" Daniel picked it up, held it as though it might crumble. His voice caught. "A letter for my daughter." Keanu's posture softened. Daniel opened it, carefully. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. His own. He hadn't remembered every word, but reading it now made him feel as though no time had passed, only guilt. He read aloud, "Dear Ella, if you ever find this, know that I never meant to disappear from your life. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I could come back when I had fixed everything. I was wrong. You were 14 the last time I saw your face. You were angry, and you had every right to be. I didn't protect us the way I should have. I didn't stand up for myself when the world turned its back. But I want you to know, I never stopped loving you. Every movie I ever edited, every reel I ever touched, I saw your face in every frame. I hope someday you'll understand. Dad." The room was quiet for a long moment. Keanu didn't say anything. He knew that silence sometimes said more than words. Daniel folded the letter back up and returned it to the canister. "I left it there in the vault the night before I was fired. I was going to send it to her later. But when the story broke, I couldn't face her. I thought maybe she'd be better off thinking I was just gone." Keanu sat on the edge of the table. "Where is she now?" Daniel hesitated. "She would be 18? I don't know. Her mother remarried. I don't even know if she kept the Whitaker name. I haven't reached out. I didn't want to reopen old wounds." Keanu looked him square in the eyes. "Then maybe it's time you did." Daniel chuckled bitterly. "And say what?" "Hey, Ella, surprise. Your dad wasn't a criminal, just a coward." Keanu shook his head. "You're not a coward. You were broken. There's a difference." Daniel stared down at the letter. "Even if she hated me, I'd take it. I'd take her yelling. I just want to know she's okay." Keanu picked up the canister, turned it in his hands thoughtfully, then set it back down. "Then let's find her." Daniel looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" Keanu smiled gently. "I mean, I know people. Researchers, quiet ones, the kind who can track a film reel across 20 years in a dozen hands. We'll find your daughter." Daniel followed Keanu out of the editing suite, the letter still trembling in his hand. A quiet resolve had taken hold of him, like muscle memory returning after years of numbness. Keanu walked ahead, already pulling out his phone, sending a message with that deliberate calm of someone who always kept his promises. They stepped into the parking lot, golden sunlight casting long shadows across the asphalt. For a moment, Daniel squinted toward the sky, as if seeing color again after years in black and white. Keanu turned. Her name was Ella Whitaker? Daniel nodded. That was her name when I last saw her. Her mother's name was Caroline Marks. She might have taken that. Keanu tapped the information into a secure contact form and sent it. This goes to someone I trust. She doesn't ask questions, just finds answers. Daniel blinked. You'd really do this? You'd spend your time, your resources, on this? Keanu shrugged. You gave me something priceless. You reminded me why I love film. This is the least I can do. Daniel's voice cracked. What if she doesn't want to see me? He let the question hang, knowing it wasn't really a question, it was a confession. Finally, he said, You're not going to her to be forgiven. You're going to give her a choice. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that. Later that night, back at Keanu's place, they sat at the kitchen island while the search got underway. Keanu made tea. Daniel didn't drink his. He just stared at the letter, now tucked into a clear protective sleeve that Keanu had found in one of his archival drawers. I was there, Daniel murmured suddenly. When she won her first school award, she read a poem she'd written about a father who vanishes into the flicker of old movies. She was just 11. Keanu looked up. I was working on a silent era restoration then. I left the screening early that night. Missed her performance. I told myself it was for her future. I kept thinking I was sacrificing now to make it right later. He exhaled, a sharp, painful breath. But there was no later. Just more sacrifices. More silence. Keanu listened without interrupting. She hated cameras after I left, Daniel added. Wouldn't let her mom take pictures. Wouldn't even smile in class photos. Said faces were for people who stayed. Keanu's hand rested on the counter between them, solid and still. Maybe. It's time her face saw yours again. The words weren't grand, but they landed deep. Just then, Keanu's phone buzzed. He checked it. One message. Found her. A single link attached. A private school alumni page. Ella Marks, class of this year. A photo next to a line of text. Student Film Award winner. Visual editing excellence. Daniel's eyes welled with disbelief. She'd followed his footsteps. Editing. Film. The very thing he thought had stolen him from her had somehow become her path. Keanu leaned in gently. She's not gone, Daniel. She's waiting in a frame you helped build. Daniel clutched the canister, not like an object, but like a lifeline. He nodded slowly, jaw tight with emotion. Will you come with me? He asked. Keanu smiled, all the way. As they stood, the real canister between them gleamed under the kitchen light, no longer just a relic of the past, but a bridge to something unfinished. The morning fog clung to the edge of the ocean, like a secret waiting to be lifted. Keanu sat beside Daniel on a quiet bench along Ocean Avenue, a thermos of coffee between them, the hum of possibility in the air. For days, Keanu's team had quietly searched through the modest threads of information Daniel could provide: old mail forwarding addresses, childhood school records, a worn photograph tucked into the corner of the real canister. And then, they found her. Ella, 18 now, working part-time at a small, independent bookstore nestled along Montana Avenue in Santa Monica, the kind of store with hardwood floors and dusty shelves and handwritten recommendation cards tucked between the spines. The kind of place her father would have taken her on quiet Sunday mornings before his life unraveled. Keanu didn't tell Daniel immediately. He wanted to be sure, to make contact in a way that wouldn't scare her. So he had a plan, a simple one. The next day, Keanu walked into the bookstore with one of his team members. No fanfare, no entourage. Just quiet steps and a soft voice asking the woman at the counter, "Is Ella working today?" The woman behind the counter blinked, startled. "She's in the back, cataloging. Would you mind giving her something?" Keanu held up a tablet on it, a short video, a few seconds long. It showed Daniel unkempt, gray-bearded, shoulders hunched, sitting at a film editing table in a dimly lit room. The footage captured him threading a delicate 35mm reel with trembling, reverent hands, repairing a broken splice, then pausing to wipe a tear as he read from the handwritten restoration notes. He didn't speak in the video, but his hands did. The woman nodded. A moment later, Ella appeared from the back. She was slender, with a quiet intelligence in her eyes, dark hair pulled into a low bun, and a small scar on her chin that matched the one Daniel had described from a childhood bike accident. She took the tablet cautiously, watched the video, then watched it again. Her face was unreadable until it wasn't. The tears came fast, not from the eyes, but from the throat, the chest. She pressed the tablet against her chest and whispered something so low the woman next to her couldn't hear. Keanu waited outside. When she came out, she didn't greet him. She stood under the awning, rain starting to mist through the air, tablet still in hand. Keanu stepped forward slowly, handing her a second item, a sealed envelope. Inside was the note from the canister. She didn't open it right away. She held it, turned it over. Her lip trembled. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "You don't have to say anything yet," Keanu replied. She nodded once, clutched the envelope, then turned and went back inside without another word. Ella didn't open the envelope that night. She placed it gently on her nightstand, beside a stack of dog-eared poetry books and an old mug filled with pens. Every time she reached for it, something in her hand paused, some invisible thread of memory tugging both ways. She didn't know whether she wanted answers or to keep the ache undefined, the way it had lived inside her for years. She remembered the smell of her dad's shirts, the rhythm of his footsteps in the hallway, the way he used to hum while doing dishes. But she also remembered the night he never came back, the sirens in the distance, the quiet tension in her mother's voice, the silence that followed, heavier than any explanation. The next day, she left the envelope unopened, but tucked into her coat pocket. At lunch break, she wandered into the back storage room of the bookstore, a place where customers weren't allowed. Among the crates of used books and backorder shipments, she pulled out a chair, and Saturday, the fluorescent light above flickered slightly, humming like a nervous heartbeat. She finally opened it. It wasn't long, less than a page, but each word had the weight of 1,000 unwritten ones. Her father had written it when he still believed he'd find a way back, when he thought he had time. Ella read it twice, then a third time. "I never stopped loving you," it said. "Not even for a day. If you ever find this, know that the only thing that kept me breathing all these years was the hope that you would." The ink had smudged in one place. A teardrop, maybe. His. Or hers. Or both across time. Ella didn't cry this time. She sat with it. She felt her jaw tighten, then release. She looked around at the shelves of forgotten books, at the quiet that surrounded her, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone in the world. That evening, when she got home, she went straight to her room. Her phone buzzed from a text. It was from the same number that had coordinated with the bookstore owner earlier. The assistant to Keanu's team had sent a message, simple and respectful. "If you ever want to send something back, we're here. No pressure, just love." But she opened the voice memo app on her phone, and for a while, she just stared at the blinking red dot. She tried speaking once, but her voice cracked. She deleted the recording. She tried again. This time, she inhaled first, held the breath, let it out slowly. Then, finally, she spoke. "Are you really him?" She paused. "You look older. But your hands, I remember your hands." Another pause. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say or feel. I'm angry, I'm confused, but mostly, I'm just scared." She sniffed, wiped her face with her sleeve. "I waited a long time to hear from you, and when I stopped waiting, I started pretending I didn't care. But I did. I still do." She pressed send before she could change her mind. The voice message was just over 30 seconds, but it cracked open something deeper than a decade of silence. The screening was held in a small private theater in Silver Lake, the kind of place where velvet seats whispered old secrets and dusty reels once projected forgotten dreams. There were no flashing cameras or red carpets, just a quiet marquee with a modest message. A film by Keanu Reeves, featuring Daniel Whitaker. Daniel sat in the back row when he first arrived. He had arrived earlier than even the crew. Keanu's assistant had told him there would be no press, no big introductions, just friends, artists, and a handful of people who still cared about stories told with their hands. His suit was charcoal gray. It hung loose on his frame, a size too big perhaps, but pressed with care. Keanu had sent it to him the week before with a handwritten note that simply said, "Wear this, you've earned it." He kept smoothing the sleeves nervously. It had been years since he had stood in front of any kind of audience, much less one waiting for a film that bore his name in the credits. His name. Not buried in legal paperwork or smudged out of history, but centered, honored. On the screen, paused for now, was the first frame of the short documentary Keanu had pieced together. The footage had come from the very reels Daniel had kept hidden in his storage locker. Shaky 16mm clips of sunsets over concrete, children laughing outside rundown theaters, an old woman lighting candles inside a shuttered church in Echo Park. But it wasn't just film. It was a mosaic of lives Daniel had seen, touched, and preserved when no one else thought it mattered. Keanu had taken that archive and added new footage of Daniel restoring the reels. Close-up shots of cracked fingertips handling film with reverence. Audio clips of him explaining the magic of decay and how sometimes beauty hides in the scratches. Keanu had done the narration himself, quiet, patient, full of awe. Daniel hadn't seen the final cut. That was part of Keanu's plan. "This story doesn't belong to me," Keanu had said. "It belongs to the man who never gave up on the truth, and to the Biston daughter who deserves to see him in the light." The guests began arriving. Fellow filmmakers, 2 editors from Keanu's studio, a retired set designer who once worked with Daniel in the 90s. Keanu himself walked in near the start time, dressed simply, his hands in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Daniel. Keanu smiled, then crossed the room with quiet energy. He reached out his hand and said, "Tonight's yours." Daniel nodded, heart pounding in his chest like a drum he hadn't heard in years. "I'm not sure I remember how to do this," he whispered. "You already did the hardest part," Keanu replied. "You survived." Just before the lights dimmed, Keanu stood at the front and addressed the small crowd. "We're here to witness something rare," he said. "The restoration of not just film, but of a name, a legacy, and maybe even a relationship that still has pages to write." He gestured to Daniel. "Would you say a few words?" Daniel's breath caught, but he stood, and that's when the door at the back of the room opened slowly. The hinges creaked just enough to draw attention, but not enough to disrupt the moment. Heads turned instinctively. And there she was, Ella. She stood in the doorway in a soft blue blouse, her hair pulled back loosely, holding a satchel over one shoulder. Her eyes scanned the dim room with hesitation, landing eventually on the man near the screen, already standing, the same man she had seen in the video. The same voice she had heard whispering through the old footage. The same signature from the letter in the canister. Daniel froze. He didn't move, didn't speak. The air seemed to thin out, as if the projector itself was holding its breath. His mouth parted slightly, but he dared not say her name. Not yet, not until she chose. Ella took one step inside. Then another. She didn't speak either. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on him, unblinking. Stepped aside, as if clearing the path without being asked. She reached the front row and quietly slipped into an empty seat. Still not a word. Daniel's eyes glistened. His hands trembled at his sides. He cleared his throat, but his voice came out raw and unsteady. I didn't know if you'd come." Ella's expression didn't change, but her hands folded tightly in her lap. Daniel looked back at the audience, remembering where he was. He swallowed hard. I never imagined I'd stand in front of a crowd again. And I certainly never imagined that if I did, it would be because someone believed in me when I couldn't even believe in myself. He turned to look at Keanu, then back at Ella. There was a time when I thought the world had forgotten me, that my mistakes defined the only version of me anyone would remember. But that wasn't true. What defines us isn't where we fall. It's what we choose to preserve, what we fight to restore. He paused, hands now gripping the podium. This film, it's not about me. It's about moments most people overlook. It's about stories hiding in dust, in scratches, in silence. It's about people who deserve to be seen. His voice cracked as he finished. And it's about hope. He stepped back, and a soft round of applause echoed through the small room. Keanu gave a slow, respectful nod. A few people wiped away tears. Daniel didn't look at Ella again as he sat down beside her, but his hands rested nervously on his knees. She didn't move away. Then, as the lights dimmed and the film reel clicked to life, she quietly reached over and placed her hand on top of his. It was small. It was everything. As the film played, soft flickers of light danced across Ella's face. She watched every frame, old footage of families, laughter, cinema workers sweeping stages, reels spinning with purpose. It was Daniel's world, and now she was part of it again. When the final frame faded to black, the room erupted into applause. But Daniel didn't move. His eyes were still locked on Ella's. She turned to him, with tears held back by the thinnest thread. "I saw you in every frame," she whispered. "You never left." For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. The applause had faded. The screen had gone dark. The lights had returned to their dim glow, casting soft amber halos over the velvet walls of the screening room. But Daniel's heart was still racing. As the small crowd of producers and friends filed out, murmuring praise and wonder at the film, Daniel stayed near the back exit, clutching a folded photo in his jacket pocket like a lifeline. Ella had remained seated for a few moments longer than everyone else. As people shuffled past her, she didn't speak. She didn't wave. She only sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the now blank screen. Finally, she stood, brushed her hands down her floral print skirt, and walked out, not through the front lobby doors, but through the side hallway leading backstage. Keanu noticed. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded once at Daniel and gave him the smallest smile. It was a signal go. Daniel's legs felt like wet cement, but he moved. Down the narrow hallway, past old film posters and shelves of cables, to the small green room they'd used for prep. Ella stood in the corner near a mirror lit by bulb-framed glass, her hands gently clasped. When Daniel entered, she turned slowly to face him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, the hum of a distant projector the only sound between them. Daniel finally reached into his jacket and pulled out the photo. "I've been carrying this for years," he said softly. "It was taken at the Griffith Observatory. You were 9. I think we just finished looking at Saturn's rings." Ella stepped forward. She took the photo in both hands, her thumb brushing lightly across the corner where it had begun to crease. "I remember that day," she whispered. "You let me stay up past midnight." Mom wasn't thrilled. Daniel's laugh caught in his throat. She never was when it came to me breaking rules. Silence again, but not an awkward one, more like the quiet that follows a storm, the kind that allows people to finally hear their own hearts beating. Ella looked down at the photo. "Why didn't you write sooner?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I didn't think I had the right. After what happened, I thought you'd be better off never seeing me again. But I waited," she said. "For something, anything, even a postcard." Daniel stepped closer but still kept a careful distance. "I wanted to. 100 times I started letters. I kept writing your name on envelopes I never mailed." She raised her eyes and met his gaze. "And when I heard your voice on that tape," she said, "restoring film like it was sacred, I realized you never stopped caring." "Not really." Daniel's shoulders dropped. For the first time in years, he felt the wall between them had a crack in it. A small one, but real. "I never stopped being your dad," he said, voice breaking. Ella's lips trembled. She didn't run to him. She simply extended her hand, and Daniel took it. Daniel didn't expect forgiveness to come as a hug, or a tear, or a grand speech. But in that quiet room, with her hand in his, something shifted, something deeper than words. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was human. Ella sat down on the worn green couch. Daniel followed, sitting beside her, but leaving a respectful space between them. She still held the photo in one hand, now resting on her lap, the corners slightly curled from years of being carried. It was faded but vivid in its emotion. "I used to keep a copy of this under my pillow," she said, "until I got angry enough to stop." Daniel looked at her, his face a mixture of pain and pride. "You had every right to be angry." "I know," she nodded, "but I didn't want to stay angry forever." He looked away for a moment, collecting himself. "You always loved stories," he said. "You'd invent characters with whole backstories. I used to think, maybe you'd become a writer." Ella smiled gently. "I still might, but these days I read more than I write." "A bookstore," Daniel said, remembering what Keanu had told him. "That suits you. It's quiet," she said. "Safe, and full of lives that don't leave." That line lingered between them. Daniel's breath caught again. He wanted to apologize again, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she didn't seem to need it repeated. Maybe it was how the silence felt fuller now, less hollow. "I never knew what happened to you," she said after a long pause. "Mom said you got sick. Mentally, that something snapped." Daniel nodded slowly. She wasn't wrong. "After I lost the project, and my reputation, something inside me just broke. I didn't want you to see me like that." Ella turned her body to face him more directly. "I wouldn't have cared. I just wanted my dad." He closed his eyes, fighting back the ache. "I wanted to be your dad, but I thought I had to disappear to protect you." Her voice softened. "I didn't need protecting. I needed truth. Even the hard parts." Daniel looked at her, and in her face, he could still see the child he once carried on his shoulders. The little girl who'd fallen asleep during Star Wars marathons and asked too many questions at the museum. But now she was a young woman grown, scarred, wise. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small object, a keychain, worn and chipped. "You gave this to me when I turned 7, she said, placing it in his hand. "You said it was your lucky charm from college." Daniel stared at it, stunned. The small silver film reel charm still clinked faintly. "I kept it," she said. "Even when I stopped looking for you, I couldn't throw it away." He held it like it was made of glass. "I thought it was lost forever." Ella looked down. "So did I. But maybe some things just wait until the time's right." He nodded. "Maybe the story doesn't end where we press." Thought. A soft knock came from the door. It opened slowly. Keanu stepped halfway into the room, but paused when he saw the moment unfolding. He gave a small smile and a slight nod. Daniel nodded back without words. Keanu quietly stepped back out, closing the door behind him. And in the room, father and daughter sat side by side, no longer strangers, not quite whole, but healing. The sun had barely risen when the press release went live. Keanu Reeves had announced a new documentary project, quietly, without fanfare, just a simple post on his foundation's page. The headline read, "The Lost Frames, a tribute to the forgotten architects of cinema." Beneath it, a photo, not of Keanu, but of Daniel Whitaker, crouched over a dusty film reel with gloves on and eyes focused. Within hours, the phone started ringing. Daniel sat at his small desk in the guest house behind Keanu's property, where he'd been staying temporarily, stunned as the screen lit up with names he hadn't seen in over a decade. A former studio archivist from Paramount, a restoration specialist from the Academy's museum, even an editor he once trained, now working on a major Marvel production. They weren't just calling to say hello. They were calling with work. The doc hadn't even started filming yet, but the word had gotten out. Keanu Reeves was co-directing it, and Daniel Whitaker the ghost of Hollywood's forgotten film world, was at the helm with him. Keanu had done something no one else dared. He'd handed the microphone back to a man the industry had discarded, not out of pity, not for PR, but because he believed the world needed to hear Daniel's voice. Daniel stared at the draft of the documentary's pitch deck. It was raw, but promising. Slides featured black and white photos of real splicers, projectionists, old-time set carpenters, and forgotten script supervisors. Men and women whose names never made headlines, but without whom the movies wouldn't exist. The subtitle read, "Stories from the Shadows, Told by Those Who Carried the Light." Ella had helped write that line. She had come over a few times since the screening, not daily, not in a rush, but with intentional steps. She asked questions, read notes, made suggestions, and once, she placed her hand on her father's shoulder when he second-guessed his worth again. "I think your eyes see things people forget to look for," she had said. "That's not just useful, that's beautiful." Keanu stopped by the guest house just after noon. Daniel looked up. "I didn't expect all this." Keanu smiled. "It was never about expecting. It was about doing the right thing and letting the world catch up." Daniel set down a faded photograph. He'd been scanning an old image of a woman threading film in a projection booth in 1962. This is Mrs. Laverne, first female projectionist in Sacramento. "I met her in '91. She used to sneak lunch to the kids waiting outside the theater. That's the kind of story people need to hear," Keanu said. "That's why we're doing this." Daniel leaned back. "I forgot how much this mattered to me." "You didn't forget," Keanu said. "You just stopped believing anyone else would care." Daniel looked out the window. "And now?" Keanu paused, then said, "Now, they're listening." Later that afternoon, Variety picked up the story, then Deadline, then IndieWire. Articles with titles like "Keanu's Next Move," "A Love Letter to the Unsung Heroes of Hollywood," and "Daniel Whitaker Returns Restoration Legend Co-Directs New Doc" began to trend. One headline simply read, "The Comeback We Didn't Know We Needed." Daniel sat with the news open on his laptop. For once, the camera wasn't pointed at the stars. It was pointed at the people who kept the stars shining, and at a man who, for years, had lived in silence. Until someone reminded him that his voice still mattered. By the end of the week, Daniel's inbox was overflowing. Studios that once ignored his calls were now requesting meetings. A major streaming service offered to license footage from his personal collection pieces of Hollywood history Daniel had preserved in rusted tins under his bed. A university in New York asked him to give a guest lecture. He hadn't spoken publicly in years, but somehow it didn't terrify him this time. Keanu watched it unfold like clockwork, not with pride or ownership, but with quiet reassurance. The kind that says, "I told you the world would remember." But there was more than nostalgia behind the project. There was purpose. The Lost Frames wasn't just about honoring the forgotten. It was about asking bigger questions. Who builds the stories we love? Who gets credit? And who fades into dust, carrying decades of brilliance in silence? The documentary became a call to action. Production began in early spring. The team was small, just Daniel, Keanu, Ella, and 2 young documentarians fresh out of USC who brought gear and unshakable energy. They filmed in garages, basements, abandoned editing rooms, and private collections. Each shoot was a treasure hunt. Daniel interviewed a 78-year-old costume seamstress who once worked on Ben-Hur and cried when she held up a dress she stitched with trembling hands. He interviewed a lighting technician who had gone blind after decades on set but could still describe the angle of a perfect key light down to the millimeter. They filmed at dawn, in shadows, in silence, capturing stories not with bright lights, but with warmth. Keanu didn't want narration. He wanted silence, pauses, unfinished sentences, real breaths between memories. He wanted viewers to sit in the weight of these lives. Daniel resisted at first. He was used to speed, tight cuts, a rhythm that demanded results. But Keanu reminded him what film used to be a meditation, not a sprint. "It's okay if people cry," Keanu said. "That's how we know they're still listening." Ella watched from behind the camera most days, headphones on, scribbling notes. But every so often, she'd reach out and touch her father's hand during an edit. "You're doing good, Dad," she whispered one night in the studio. Daniel blinked. The word hit him in the chest. "Dad." He didn't respond. He just kept editing. The industry buzz grew louder. A short clip posted on Keanu's social media showed Daniel talking about a forgotten assistant director named Charlie Kim. The post went viral, not because of star power, but because of Daniel's voice, steady, respectful, emotional. "He ran the set on time for 20 years, Daniel said in the video. "He held the whole thing together. Never won an award. But without him, half your favorite scenes wouldn't exist." The comments were flooded with people tagging friends, family, mentors. A costume designer wrote, "I was Charlie Kim once. Thank you for seeing us." A theater usher commented, "This made me feel like I was part of the story." Film students began messaging Daniel, asking how to preserve reels, where to find old footage, how to stay in the game without selling their soul. Daniel didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to try. The studio was quiet that morning. Early light spilled across the hardwood floors, soft and golden. Dust floated gently through the air, catching in the slants of sunlight like fading memories being stirred awake. The building hadn't changed much since they first stepped into it together. The paint still peeled slightly near the back wall. The coffee machine sputtered like it always had. But something about it felt different now. Keanu walked in first, carrying a brown paper bag and 2 coffees. Daniel followed behind slowly, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the room as if it had grown overnight into something sacred. On the wall above the editing station, it was waiting for them. The dollar bill, crisp, clean, and now pressed inside a simple black frame with a small metal plaque beneath it. Just beside it, mounted with equal care, was the restored reel Daniel had brought back from near destruction, the reel that started everything. Daniel stepped closer, silent at first. His eyes flicked between the 2 frames, and he shook his head gently, a smile tugging at the edge of his lips. He looked older today, but not tired, not worn. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and emerged with soot in his hair and clarity in his heart. He reached out a hand and lightly touched the glass over the dollar. "For a long time," he said, "I thought this was all I was worth." Keanu stood beside him, placing the coffees on the table without a word. Daniel's voice was steady but quiet. "I asked you for $1, just to get me back into the room, just so I could say I still mattered." He turned to Keanu now. "But what you gave me wasn't money. It was this." He gestured around the studio. At the editing equipment, the reels, the soft hum of the machines, and finally, back at the framed reel beside the dollar. "You gave me my life back." Keanu didn't rush his reply. He let it sit between them, the gravity of the words. He looked at the wall, then at Daniel. "No," he said gently. "You earned it. I just noticed." Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding. That small acknowledgement, those 5 words, meant more than any standing ovation or studio contract. He had fought for years to feel seen. And now, without banners or applause, someone finally had. They sat down in the editing chairs, the same ones they'd used months ago, when this was still just an idea, a gamble, a desperate attempt to prove that something lost could still have value. Now, it was a legacy. Daniel sipped the coffee, staring straight ahead at the screens that had once made him feel powerful, then broken, and now whole again. "You remember when I used to run a whole floor of editors?" he asked with a faint smile. Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I remember." "I thought I'd die in that darkness," Daniel said softly. "The silence after no one returned my calls, the sting of being forgotten. I didn't realize how much of my identity was wrapped up in that chair, in those reels, in being the guy people came to when something needed saving. You still are that guy, Keanu said. Daniel chuckled lightly. Yeah, but now I do it with a little more humility and a lot less hair gel. They both laughed, the kind of warm, tired laughter that only comes after long winters of the soul. Then Daniel looked back at the wall one more time. The dollar, the reel, that frame, he said, reminds me every day that someone believed I wasn't finished. Keanu nodded again. You were never finished, Daniel. Just paused. Daniel leaned back in his chair, and for a long moment, he didn't speak. He just let the silence settle around them, soft like an old friend. There was peace in that quiet, not emptiness. For a man who once dreaded being alone with his thoughts, Daniel had grown to appreciate stillness again. You know what that reel taught me? Daniel said at last, eyes still on the wall. Keanu turned slightly toward him. What? That memory doesn't fade. Not if someone is willing to hold the light on it long enough. Keanu didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Daniel tapped the side of his coffee cup. I used to think film was just about control. You control what the audience sees. You manipulate time. You decide where their eyes go, what emotion they feel. He paused. But now, I think the real power of it is remembering what we're afraid to lose. The words hung in the air like a truth long waiting to be spoken. Outside, the city began to wake. Traffic hummed faintly. Sunlight glinted off passing cars. But inside the studio, the world had narrowed to two men and a framed dollar that meant more than its ink and paper. Keanu stood and walked over to the reel. He gently touched the edge of the frame, tracing the metal plaque beneath it with his finger. Then he looked back at Daniel. I didn't hang this for the film, he said. I hung it because you saved it. Daniel looked at him, confused for a second. You rescued something no one believed could be rescued, Keanu continued. Not just the footage, yourself. Daniel swallowed hard. That reel was in pieces, warped, cracked. No studio would have bothered. But you did, Keanu said. You took the time, the care, the belief. Daniel smiled, but his eyes were wet. Because I knew what it felt like to be discarded. Keanu nodded slowly. Maybe that's why you were the only one who could fix it. They sat in silence again. But it wasn't awkward. It was full of things that didn't need to be spoken. Regret, gratitude, the strange ache of redemption. Daniel finally broke the silence with a soft chuckle. You know, I almost didn't come back to that set. When you first called me, I thought it was a joke. I stared at your voicemail for a full hour before I hit play. I was afraid you wouldn't, Keanu admitted. But something told me, if you did, everything would change. And it did, Daniel said. Not just for me, for Ella. For everything I thought I'd lost. He looked back at the framed dollar again. That dollar isn't about the money. It's a marker, a reminder that I had to bet on myself again. And someone gave me just enough hope to do it. Keanu walked over to the coffee machine and poured himself a refill. He raised the cup slightly in a quiet toast. To the bets that matter, he said. Daniel raised his own. And the people who take them. They clinked cups, the sound small but resonant, like a bell echoing far down into memory. The morning light shifted again, casting a gentle glow on the wall. The dollar bill, the film reel, symbols of failure and redemption, frozen in time. But now, they belong to the future. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to understand the weight of a small moment. A handshake, a dollar, a decision to say yes when it would have been easier to walk away. I've learned that the world doesn't always reward goodness in loud ways, but it remembers, quietly, deeply. And sometimes, when the timing is right, that memory becomes the doorway to something unexpected. When I think about Daniel now, I don't see the man who disappeared from the industry. I don't see the reclusive editor people whispered about. I see the man who never stopped loving the craft, even when it didn't love him back. The man who, given one reel and one chance, showed the world that what's broken isn't always gone. That framed dollar on the wall wasn't about debt. It was about belief, a symbol of a promise that didn't need words. Sometimes all someone needs is a sign that they're still seen. That's the part of this journey that stays with me most. We live in a world that moves fast. People fall behind, get lost, slip through the cracks. It's easy to forget them. Easier still to assume they wanted to be forgotten. But I wonder how many Daniels are out there right now, waiting, hiding, hoping for a sign that it's not too late. The truth is, the greatest gifts we give aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones we don't even know we're offering. A phone call, a seat at the table, a second chance. The world taught me that fame opens doors, but it's humanity that holds them open. Daniel didn't need a savior. He needed a witness. Someone to look him in the eye and say, "I remember who you are." That's the quiet power we all carry. The power to see someone, really see them, even when the world tells us to look away. I've received that grace too. In my darkest hours, it was never the spotlight that saved me. It was the unexpected hand. The friend who didn't give up. The stranger who said the right thing at the right time. Those are the stories that change us, and those are the stories worth telling. When I stood beside Daniel, watching him place that dollar in a frame, I realized something. I hadn't given him anything extraordinary. I had just responded to a request with a yes, $1. But for Daniel, it was everything. That's the mystery of kindness. You never know when your smallest gesture will be someone else's turning point. And maybe that's the challenge for all of us. To stay soft in a hard world. To believe that behind every cold silence, every failed project, every forgotten name, there might still be a spark. One worth fanning, one worth remembering. We live in an age where it's easier to scroll past than stop and ask. But the truth is, every person you pass has a reel playing behind their eyes. A story unfinished, a chapter paused, a dream waiting for its cue. I used to think second chances came wrapped in grand gestures, but now I know they hide in everyday things. A coffee shared, a smile returned, a dollar slipped into someone's hand, not out of pity, but out of trust. That's what Daniel taught me. He didn't ask for charity, he asked to be remembered, to matter, to be counted among the living again. And what a difference it made. That film he helped create, what started as lost footage, became a living tribute, not just to himself, but to every name that rolls past the credits unnoticed. The sound techs, the assistants, the extras, the editors, the forgotten ones who hold the frame steady. Daniel's name now lives among them again, not just as a footnote, but as a light. When I see his framed dollar beside the restored reel, I don't see payment, I see resurrection, and it humbles me. Because I didn't fix him. I couldn't. What I did was far simpler. I opened the door. And maybe that's what we're all meant to do for each other. Not rescue, not repair, but remind. Remind people of who they were before the world told them otherwise. And maybe that's why you're here too. Maybe there's someone in your life, an old friend, a distant parent, a forgotten colleague who's still waiting. Someone who never stopped caring, even when they stopped showing up. This story isn't just about film, or even about Daniel. It's about the quiet redemption we all crave, and the beautiful truth that it's never too late. Never too late to finish a film. Never too late to make a call. Never too late to be seen again. So today, I want to ask you something. Not as a celebrity, not as a storyteller, but as a man who's been saved by grace more times than I can count. Who did you once overlook? Who might need your yes? Because maybe they're still out there, waiting for a knock on the door, a cup of coffee, a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, you're the one who can give it. If this story moved you, if you've ever been on either side of a second chance, I want to hear from you. Comment below with the words, "I still believe." Because belief is where redemption begins. And while you're at it, tell us, Who gave you your second chance? Was it a teacher? A sibling? A friend you hadn't spoken to in years? Let their name live here. Let their act of grace echo. Because every story like Daniel's deserves to be told. And every quiet redemption, no matter how small, deserves to be remembered. So, here's to the forgotten frames, the lost reels, the stories waiting to be restored. And here's to you still watching, still believing, still willing to open the door. Thank you for being part of this story. Now, go start your own.